Tanks form the shock force of modern armies, the iron fist with which 20th century generals batter down an enemy. 100 years ago, it was the cavalry, mounted swordsmen or lancers, who rushed across the battlefield to deliver the decisive blow. On today's battlefields, like here in Israel on the Golan Heights, modern cavalrymen ride to the charge on tracks, behind cannon and armor. Here on this Merkava, the Hebrew word for chariot, you can clearly see the three principles that have been fundamental to the concept of the tank from the beginning: protection, firepower, and mobility. For protection, there's the armor plating, a foot or more thick here at the front end. Uniquely, this tank has its engine also in the nose as added protection for its crew. For firepower, there's the 105mm gun, a weapon that can knock out another tank 2 miles away. There are also 3 heavy machine guns up there on top. Mobility is provided by the 900 horsepower engine underneath here. It means that this 60-ton monster can travel 20 miles an hour across open country, it can climb a 30-degree gradient, and it can cross 9-foot ditches. These then are the 3 principles of every tank, and throughout its short history, its success has depended on getting the right balance between them. It was on battlefields 2,000 miles distant from the Golan and 80 years away in time that the idea of the tank was introduced to the military imagination. The First World War crisscrossed the landscape with barbed wire, trenches, and crater fields. Cavalry, which had won quick victories for 2,000 years, was blown from the battlefield in the first few weeks. The Industrial Revolution had made the cavalryman and his horse obsolete, but it had invented new forms of horsepower that unconventional minds realized could be made to take their place. The Caterpillar tractor, seen here in a film of 1908 advertising its usefulness to the farmer, was one of them. Machines like these took hold of the imagination of soldiers like Ernest Swinton. Appalled by his first sight of the Western Front, his mind turned to the tractor as a way through it. On Christmas Day, 1914, he wrote a requirement for a bulletproof vehicle which would roll down barbed wire by sheer weight and support the advance by machine gun fire. It would become the specification for the first tank. This is one of the earliest tanks. It's called the Mark IV and came into service in 1917. Already the 3 principles are beginning to show up, albeit in rudimentary form. Mobility. On these tracks, it could roll at 3.5 miles an hour. For firepower, Hotchkiss machine guns, and further forward, the 6-pounder. But it was in protection that the British Army was mainly interested. And although its armor was only ½ an inch thick, it was enough to protect the crew from enemy fire. Fear naught was the motto adopted by the British Tank Corps from the earliest days, in tribute to the tank's bullet-stopping skin. The tank was a revolutionary weapon. To man it on the battlefield demanded a special breed of soldier. One of the pioneers, George Brown, recalls the early days.
There was a crew of 8 in the tank. There was the driver on the primary gears. The officer sat on his left on the handbrakes. I was a Lewis gunner. There were 2 Lewis gunners in each sponson, 2 sponsons on each side of the tank. So it took 4 men to drive the tank. And the other 4 men were just gunners.
Mag switch, check gun.
You were trained to do all the jobs. You were trained on the secondary gears, you were trained on the machine guns, you were trained on the 6-pounder guns, and of course you were trained as a driver.
Good. Gun free and lock. Check gear stick. Neutral. Check clutch. Stand by to start.
The story of the tank can be told by looking at how it has mastered each of its three principles. Protection first, because it was protection the British Army valued highest. Protection for the tank crews, and protection for the infantry following the paths that the tank crushed in the barbed wire. Tank was the cover name adopted while the machines were being built for the Great British Offensive on the Somme in 1916. On the first day, none were ready. The British advanced unprotected against the German machine guns, and 20,000 British soldiers died. 2 months later, with a handful of tanks, the British won the little Battle of Flers at far less cost in lives.
Once we started to open fire on the Germans, all hell was let loose. High explosive bursting overhead, shells hitting the ground and bursting. When you first opened fire, there was already the rattle of their machine gun bullets and rifle bullets hitting the side of the tank. And unless they were armor-piercing bullets, they didn't penetrate the tank. They just made a dent, that's all.
You heard a rattle on the outside. It was like something hitting a tin can. The machine gun bullets didn't penetrate, but they threw off shale on the inside of the tank. And it used to pit the face with tiny bits of steel, you see, and they used to bleed. You came out looking a bit sorry. They're so well protected. If you had a direct hit, then you can't say anything about it. You've got to suffer that. For machine gun fire and that sort of thing, it didn't offer any fear at all. No, your object was to get there and back. You didn't see any fear.
Protection came to obsess the minds of some tank designers. Weight defeats mobility in tank design. That's one of the iron rules. Unless, that is, the size of the gun and ammunition load is reduced. The British Matilda, at the start of World War II, had almost impenetrable armor, but its gun, as a consequence, was practically a toy. The American Sherman avoided this defect. It had a good gun and great mobility. It was indeed almost a perfect design, except for poor protection, as some Sherman crewmen recall.
When we first got them, we thought they were a smashing tank. We did take quite a while in readjusting all the inside pieces to suit our individual tastes. No tank is ever made that suits the whole crew. So you take some pieces out and throw them away, and you put in other pieces, and you alter things around just to suit yourself. Perhaps the metal was a bit thin. We had extra plates welded on the side, right across the ammunition ports. Of course, if you were slightly sideways to the enemy, had a beautiful aiming mark.
It was all hedgerows. We had to go climb over the hedgerows. And every time we show our belly, the Germans would fire 30 millimeters into our belly and blow us up, because that was a very vulnerable spot. The tank around us, our power was all steel, but the belly wasn't that thick. So what they did, the engineers designed a prong, and they welded this onto the front of the tank. So instead of going over the hedgerow, we went through the hedgerow.
But it was the Russians who first hit upon the perfect compromise between a tank's mobility, firepower, and protection. The result was called the T-34. Its qualities astounded German tankmen like Henry Mettelman.
We found the T-34 a very effective weapon. We were frightened of it. When we met it at the first time, they just drove through our lines, and we had little chance to shoot them because they have this shape in front, while ours are more straight. You could hit ours better than theirs. When you hit them, the thing went off or down below.
German crews manning their early tanks thought the design was good.
They seemed to me something like iron horses. I was proud to belong to Panzer troops. We got the Panzer III and we got the Panzer IV. I saw them driving around. It's a powerful thing to watch, and I thought, yes, to be a member of such an army, that's something to be proud of. So I was looking forward to training.
The Panther, and later the Tiger, were the Germans' answer to their experience of meeting the T-34. They had called for bigger guns and stronger armor, and got them in these powerful machines. But however thick the armor, tank men know they are vulnerable to the right shot.
I drove several tanks and also worked with the infantry and the supporting units, tank supporting units. I personally was always happier when I was in a trench, or that wasn't a nice experience either, but in a trench you could put your head down and you could keep out of the way. In a tank you were just sitting there and you were relying totally on your luck that you should not be hit.
I think when you looked at the poor bloody infantry outside, you felt at times sort of very affectionate towards your tank, this wonderful steel womb within which you travelled. On the other hand, although that protected you against shell and mortar fire so long as you were inside it, you were, when you moved across open ground, a very large target for the very accurate and effective German guns, and if you had any sort of imagination, you were aware of what would happen when they got you in their sights.
Tanks, of course, have never been able to offer their crews complete protection. Indeed, part of the story of the tank has been the deadly competition of technological development. As soon as one designer comes up with improved armor, others set about trying to find ways to penetrate it. And this is what happens when protection fails. This Israeli tank dump gives us a glimpse of what happens when a shot strikes home, but not the unforgettable sight of a tank catching fire.
For the moment, you see a cloud of smoke goes around it, and then there's nothing, and then all of a sudden, from where the hole is, smoke starts to come, and then the smoke gradually increases. It's just like lighting a bonfire in the garden. Up it goes, the ammunition catches, the petrol catches, and then it's a ball of fire. And when that goes, that's quite a frightening sight.
We got hit with an 88, right in the middle. The two in the front got killed. The tank commander got out. I got out, and I was burnt. I lost a part of my ear, and I was burnt on my arm. Anyway, I rolled off the back of the tank. But the radio operator had to come out after I got out, had to go underneath the gun and come out. He never made it. He was afire already, because the whole tank blew up. We had just reloaded with a full tank of ammunition, 75 millimeter shells plus machine gun bullets. And as he came out, he was aflame. They did him a favor. They sprayed him and they killed him. They finished him.
If a tank had brewed up and any member of the crew was in the tank and they were burnt, that smell of burning is once again a smell that stays with you. Even nowadays, I hate the smell of burning flesh. If the oven gets a bit hot at home and the meat gets cooked a bit too much, I don't like it. It's a horrible smell.
Anti-tank guns grew deadlier as the war went on. The German 88 was the most effective, made all the more lethal because Germans perfected the trick of drawing enemy tanks into its killing zone. The greatest of the tank killing zones of the Second World War was to be laid by the Russians for the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. The Germans codenamed it Operation Citadel and intended it to be the most decisive tank attack so far. They started the assault with 2,700 tanks. The Russians, who had long been expecting the attack, had prepared one of the strongest defensive positions in the history of warfare. 6,000 anti-tank guns and millions of mines. The German fighting machine was ground down by the weight of fire. Then, on the 6th day of the battle, the Russians went over to the offensive themselves, with nearly 4,000 of their own tanks. A 1,000 German tanks were destroyed. The carnage at Kursk revealed all too clearly how vulnerable tanks were when they were launched at strong anti-tank defenses. The tactical strike aircraft now became the tank's deadliest enemy. Against the newly developed air-to-ground missile, the tank's armor cracked like snail shells under a bird's beak. Soon, the tank had to fear infantrymen, too, who had acquired a miniaturized anti-tank weapon. A brave soldier could now kill a tank single-handed. The threat of the missile has had its effect on post-war tanks. Now their armor is sloped at steeper angles to deflect attack, gapped to absorb chemical energy, layered to shatter solid shot. But missiles can still do terrible damage, as Israeli Tank Commander General Yossi testifies.
My tank was hit by a Sagar missile, wire-guided missile, on 12 October on Tel Shams in the Golan.
This British swing fire is the equivalent of the Sagar.
We fight with open hatch, and I was with half of my body outside, operating the machine gun. When the missile arrived, I was entangled in the wires. It was a wire-guided missile. And then the second one came. It comes very slowly, like a ball of fire, rolling into your face, explosion in the turret, and then the next thing, a very high heat wave that takes you, and then I felt that I was flying, and the next thing I found myself on the ground, fairly smashed. This explosion, unlike a shell, is not an impact. A shell, and I've been in situations when shells hit my tank, is an impact, fragmentation. The fragmentation that happens, you don't feel. What you feel is this enormous wave of heat around you, and these pressures that just blow you out. And if you're lucky, you stay alive to tell the story.
These ruined tanks from 3 Arab-Israeli wars show all too clearly what happens when protection fails. And they are the grim proof of the second principle in every tank's design: firepower. Experience has proved that there is no such thing as total protection. To survive, a tank crew must control the means to destroy its attackers. It must have mighty firepower. Commander, gunner, loader, driver. The first 3 are involved in firing the gun.
When you fire this 105mm gun, the whole turret is filled with explosion, and then a blast of this gunpowder that remains in the gun and it all come back to the turret. And after the third shot or the fourth shot, the crew inside hardly breathes, and the gunner has to manage to make corrections of half of a meal within this kind of noise. And it's very, very tough on the individual.
British heavy tanks of World War I were of two types. One was armed only with machine guns in its role of supporting infantry. The other, designed to destroy strong points, had machine guns and a 6-pounder naval gun. The A7V, Germany's first tank, had 6 machine guns manned by infantrymen and a cannon served by artillerymen. The engines were supervised by sappers. So there was a total crew of 18. With so many men to accommodate, the A7V was a large and clumsy vehicle. Small wonder it did so badly in the first tank-to-tank engagement in history on April the 24th, 1918. Maneuvering to avoid British fire, it overturned and was abandoned by its crew. Appropriately, its opponent was No. 1 tank of No. 1 Section, A Company, 1st Battalion, British Tank Corps. Tank versus tank fights, rare in the First World War, became commonplace in the Second. The caliber of the tank's main armament climbed steadily throughout the war, with the Allies lagging behind the Germans.
The British tanks were, throughout the war, undergunned in comparison with the German tanks. To deal with an enemy target, it was necessary to come within something like 200 to 300 yards and place armor-piercing shot either through the turret ring of the German tank or through the periscopes.
Against infantry, the tank's firepower was always devastating, especially if it was equipped with a flamethrower, like the Churchill Crocodile.
There was one particular place where we were actually more or less pinned down by even snipers. Every time a tank commander put his head up, he was fired on. And there was quite a number got head injuries there. And we sent for help. And help came in the form of a flamethrower. One spurt straight up and down the tree, and there was 8 bodies strapped up in the tree, now hanging down loose. We then continued on our journey.
Andrew Wilson commanded such a tank.
We started firing inevitably earlier than we should have done, but we continued flaming right up to the target, and there was a horrible sound, I remember, which I thought could have been the squeaking of the tracks, but in fact were, I believe, the screaming of men. We did, in fact, burn people on that occasion. The sight of the body that the flamethrower had incinerated was particularly horrible.
Since the Second World War, the tank's main gun has become even more powerful. Range finding is far more accurate, and stabilization systems make it possible to fire on the move.
The gun, which is a major weapon system, the 2 machine guns, in our case the 3 machine guns, the mortar that we put, the immediate smoke, the hand grenades, the personal weapon systems that you hold, all this give you, with your 3 other crew members, firepower equivalent to a full infantry company. You can really aim this fire, and that's the main role of the tank, to move around the battlefield and to bring this firepower under the possession of 4 people, directed to one target, and win the battle.
was the aim with which the tank visionaries began. They saw a battlefield on which movement was all but impossible. An armored machine seemed to promise the means of restoring mobility to the soldier. But could those pioneers have even glimpsed the astonishing speed and agility that their brainchild would attain?
Well, the third principle that underlies the concept of the tank, and is the principle that's done more than anything else to change the face of battle in the 20th century, is its mobility. I'm standing in the turret of Challenger, Britain's latest main battle tank, and we just came down a section of that track behind us at over 45 miles an hour. Despite its 62 tons of all-up weight, the Challenger will also go over the roughest terrain very fast indeed, either forwards or, if necessary, backwards. It's tanks like these and their predecessors that have given back to commanders that element of shock that they lost when cavalry disappeared from the battlefield.
The tank reintroduced movement into modern warfare after the stalemate of the First World War, even if the speeds of the early tanks pale into insignificance compared to the modern tank. On no battlefield of the First World War did the tank really make good its potential as an instrument of mobility. At first, it was used in numbers too small to count. Then it was misused, launched in the spring of 1917 into a battlefield that had been shelled into a bomb. At Cambrai in the autumn of 1917, when tanks were used en masse for the first time, cooperation with the infantry broke down. The attack, brilliantly successful at the outset, finally failed. At Amiens in 1918, the greatest of the tank battles of the war, it was the tanks themselves which failed to live up to their promise. They proved too slow and too unreliable. They undoubtedly terrified the Germans, but they did not demonstrate that they were a decisive instrument of breakthrough. With the victory of the Allies, the traditional high command thought that trench warfare would not happen again, so the importance of the tank was downgraded. The Americans even abolished the tank corps after 1918. In France, the infantry and artillery fought for control of the tanks, and the infantry won. This meant tanks became the infantry's handmaiden. In the British Army, the tank corps, though well established by 1926, was resented, especially by the cavalry. The conservative military leaders of the day saw the tank's job as supporting the other arms in the various roles once carried out, as the battle developed, by the cavalry.
You had a sort of period of skirmishing as you approached the enemy, in which you had light forces, which in the very old days had been cavalry, who told you where the enemy were while you made up your mind whether or not you were actually going to accept battle and how you were going to accept it. And then you had a major battle in which the infantry took a classic part. And they saw tanks as being required for two things: to act as sort of light cavalry, in which case you wanted light tanks, and to act in support of the infantry in the main battle itself, and also to act, as cavalry was used in the Middle Ages and beyond, as a sort of shock action at a crucial part in the battle which had been created by the infantry fighting.
Yet it was two British military thinkers, Basil Liddell Hart and General Fuller, who proposed the idea of the tank revolution. They argued that the tank was the key to the military future, and that far from being anyone's handmaiden, the tank was destined to be the queen of battle, around which all other arms would be organized. Their views aroused as much official enthusiasm as the arrival of a horse butcher at a cavalry barracks. In Germany, where defeat had shattered the power of vested interests, Liddell, Hart and Fuller found a hearing. Germany had been forbidden tanks by the Versailles Treaty, but the army had experimented with them in secret. By 1933, they had a few prototypes. When they were demonstrated to Adolf Hitler, he exclaimed with delight, "That's what I need." That's what I want. He lavished money on the German Panzer arm so that by 1939 it could field 10 tank divisions. They were organized to attack, as Fuller and Little Hart had taught, in a compact mass, supported overhead by clouds of tactical aircraft. Their aim was to create irresistible shock on a very narrow front and break in. Once break-in had been achieved, breakthrough was to be completed by finding and exploiting the weak spots inside the enemy positions. It would spread panic and cause psychological as much as material damage. Blitzkrieg, the Germans called the new concept, lightning war. Blitzkrieg struck down Poland first, and then Holland, Belgium, and France. But it was in Russia that Blitzkrieg achieved its most spectacular effects. The world will hold its breath, boasted Hitler at the outset of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. 3 army groups, each tipped by the cutting edge of a panzer corps, broke through the Red Army. 300, 600, 900,000 Russian soldiers and their equipment were swallowed up at a single gulp. Blitzkrieg had changed the face of warfare.
I remember when we took Rostov, for instance, with the tanks, and I was one of the first tanks who drove into Rostov when we took the city away from the Russians. To have conquered a town, to go into the town square, and there were all the burned out trams were lying around, and you got out of your tank, you were black from all the oil and dust and things flowing around. You had taken a town, you have beaten the enemy, you are the master of it. Okay, a few of them got killed, of your own mates or so. You went over to the other crews and you were laughing again, and then one quickly forgot all the horror things.
In the western desert of North Africa, the Germans also waged a war of movement against the British, though not one they had all their own way. The British were acquiring better tanks and becoming expert in using them. In Europe, the Americans too quickly grasped the secrets of tank warfare. When the Allies descended on Normandy in 1944 to begin the liberation of France, they proved to the Germans that they too had mastered the tactics of breakthrough. Overwhelming air power was part of the secret, widespread use of radio the other.
The magic ingredient for even the tanks themselves to be controlled was the development of being able to use radio sets down to every individual tank on the move.
Pulled back, and they looked as if they...
Here on the plains of Germany, British tank crews in their chieftains developed the difficult art of communicating by radio.
Charlie, this is a warning order. Alpha, 3 tanks, grid, 612-783. Mission to destroy. Wait, Charlie, right flanking. The Delta. Call sign of 10, 30, and 40. To move around Firebase. Call sign of 10, current location. Call sign 20 with this call sign will mask and prevent enemy movement.
The other 10 tanks in your company, them you have to control through radio. It's very difficult. You have to convey to them through some metallic voice all the emotions, all the energy that you want them to carry in the situation where they face the enemy, and you want them to be placed in the right position, because sometimes 2 meters makes a difference.
1112, good 612, 783. Next fire position is just to the left of the barn on the barn. 0, this is Oscar 10.
The problem, of course, as with any military command, is to know what's going on and to be able to see as far as possible. Very seldom possible to see where everybody was. You are the whole time concentrating on what is going on the radio, as well as using your own eyes and your own feel about all the noises going on. And of course, you are on the radio forwards as well as backwards.
Oscar 20, this is reference for contact. An 11 probe, 5612-283, confirm one tank, application over. Oscar 20, at the moment. Oscar 21 is moving round, over. Sarah, roger, out.
As the Second World War drew to its climax, the tank began to fall victim to attrition, the very sort of warfare it had been conceived to overcome. Vast production was matched by vast losses. The British and Americans, who produced 30,000 tanks in 1943, found they needed all that came off the factory line. The Russians manufactured 15,000, but suffered losses at a comparable rate. But this industrial war was one the Germans could not win. Though astoundingly they produced 6,000 tanks in 1943, they could barely make good their losses. Kursk had been a terrible blow for them, the first and greatest of the attrition battles. The British equivalent was Operation Goodwood, where they lost 300 tanks in 2 days. It was their great tank offensive designed to break out of Normandy in 1944, and it failed. In the Battle of Berlin, the Red Army lost 2,000 tanks and assault guns in 3 weeks fighting. The Israelis have sometimes been able to recapture the exhilarating pace of blitzkrieg in their wars against the Arabs. But increasingly they too have found that mass tank battles on narrow fronts kill crews and fill tank graveyards in the same way that the Western Front killed infantry. The tank has also proved to have its limitations. In built-up areas, in close country, in the jungle, as the Americans found in Vietnam, it is all too vulnerable to close-range weapons handled by a hidden enemy. Yet the whole experience of tank warfare, good and bad, has made the men who live in and fight from these armored monsters a breed apart from other soldiers.
The noise is terrific. It's not only the noise of the engine and of the tracks or of the gunfire outside or of your own gun. It's also the noise that's coming through your headphones, the mush, which can be absolutely piercing. It was also, of course, very closed in. It didn't do to be claustrophobic. There was total confusion. It's what Clausewitz called the fog of war. I mean, it was really very literally there in my experience.
Every battle is chaotic. When you are in a tank, especially as a driver, and you don't see very much, it is chaotic. You get new orders every few minutes, a little bit to here, a little bit to there. As an infantry soldier, there's a certain purpose in it. You see what you are doing. You can defend yourself. Having no vision of what is going on around you, that creates a chaotic condition in your mind.
When you were in action, the tank commander was either sitting on a very, very small seat or mainly standing up. If he was standing up, average chap could just about look over the edge of the cupola. And you'd be standing there for about 12, 14 hours during the day in the summer. In that time, you've got very little exercise in yourself.
And we found to start with, we were getting something that was called tank commander's legs. The legs just became very swollen between the knees and the ankles. It was very, very painful. You daren't take your boots off. If you took your boots off, you'd never get them back on again.
It's horrible. I disliked it all the time. One never admits it, really. One always tries to tell, as a young soldier, heroic stories, but the smell and the noise. In summer, it's very hot. In winter, it's very cold.
When the winter came on, if you were feeling a little hungry, you could shove potatoes down the exhaust pipes of the tank and let them rumble away in the silencers for a minute or two, and then you revved up the thing, you held a bucket there, you had a bucket full of beautiful roast potatoes or things like that, and against orders we were always brewing up tea on our petrol cookers inside the tank. But the big problem when we were in action for a long time, you know, perhaps 3 or 4 hours, and you were completely closed down, you couldn't get out, of course, how did you pee? And the only way to cope with this problem was that you shoved a 75mm round into the gun, you fired off the round in the direction of Germany, you got out the shell case, and you used that. But you had to be very careful because these shell cases were very hot when they came out of the breech.
The only toilet you had was your steel helmet. You use it for anything and everything, besides shaving. But you also use it for your toilet. You open up your little cubby hole, and out they went back on your head again.
On operations, which of course was most of the time in Normandy and Northwest Europe, we would sleep at night under a canvas bivouac beside the tank if we bothered to put that up. I mean, often we would just sort of sleep on the ground, on our ground sheets, sometimes under the tank, because that offered a degree of safety, though there were people who told horrid tales of tanks having sunk into the ground and killed people.
Hey, come on. Okay. Come on, Matt. Come on, Matt.
When you're in a tank, it's like a snow. You're carrying your own house around with you. Everything you want is with you. You've got to carry on the tank all your belongings that you need stacked somewhere on the tank. Your blankets, your ground sheet. We had our tank adapted to, on the front was these brackets. We had little ammunition boxes with all our personal bits and pieces in there. The odd bottle of whiskey or two when we got the chance. That was in there as well.
You the brew, Mother. Cheers. Yeah. Cheers, Doug.
All our pockets were full of coffee. We didn't bother putting in ammunition because the coffee was important in the morning. You're cold, you want a cup of coffee. The infantrymen used to love us for that. They'd bang their rifle on a tank and shove in their cup through the porthole, and we'd heat up the water for them, and they'd have hot coffee. So they used to love that, you see.
Come on, tell mate.
You want to look at that too?
Yeah, we'll be going anyway for it.
We ate together. It was immediately possible to spot the best cook in the crew or in the troop. And we shared the same mess tins. We often passed the same mug around. We ate with the same knives and forks. All these inhibitions of peacetime went. I mean, we were as close as men could be to each other, and without any sort of sexual connotation. This was a matter really of loving people with whom you worked, and I don't think it too much of a hyperbole to say that that is what did exist in the tank crew. It was love in the best sense of the word.
The tank is, and seems likely to remain, the principal instrument of ground warfare. Its enemies may increase, but despite the risks and threats that menace the tank today, most experienced veterans of armored warfare believe in the tank's future.
My view is that the tank is gonna be with us for many, many years to come, but it might change its shape. It might be a little bit different than it looks now, but the concept of a mobile platform that brings into the battlefield 3 dimensions, the protection, first, the firepower on board of this protection, with the mobility, is gonna last with us for as long as the wars will continue in the land.
The real problem on the battlefield of today, as it has been all down the centuries, is how to go forward in the face of the enemy. It is not an easy thing to do. The development of weapons systems in all armies tends to favor the defense, tends to make it very difficult to go forward from where you are towards where the enemy is. That is what the tank was originally produced for, and that is what the tank is primarily required for now, is a means of getting firepower forward from one place to another in the face of very considerable fire from the enemy. Now, you're not going to be able to do that without any armor around you. You're not going to be able to do it just in a bulletproof vest. You're not going to be able to do it in a helicopter, which is very vulnerable on the battlefield. You will therefore require a form of mobility, which will get you over the ground, which must be mechanical, because if you're going to take any protection with you, that's got to be moved by mechanical means. The problem for the tank in the future will be just what sort of firepower it's got to carry with it.